In this video, I'm going to be demonstrating how to take watercolor paper and stretch it so that it remains taut and smooth on your work surface. When you're working with watercolors, the amount of water that you introduce onto the paper tends to make it warp and buckle and cause your colors to run into these wrinkles and troughs in the paper. And stretching the paper is going to prevent that. So to do this today, I'm going to need a pencil, some watercolor paper. I'm using a Canson 140 pound thickness watercolor paper, a sponge, a bowl or cup of water, as well as access to running water in a sink, some brown gummed watercolor tape. It's shiny here, matte on this side. This is what it looks like. Comes in a roll. And a board or work surface that you're going to be taping the paper to. We have these wooden boards in the classroom, and on this one I've got a pretty clean area here. If someone has used too much paint and it bled through, or they had a spill, there might be a large dark spot like this. You don't want to put your paper on top of any of those, so if you have one through here, let's get you a different board. The concept behind stretching watercolor paper is that this paper is going to be immersed in water so that the whole thing is wet, and as the water soaks into the paper fibers, they're going to expand ever so slightly. And in theory, that's going to make this paper a little bit larger than it is in its dry state. While that paper is a little bit bigger, we're going to be taping it down onto a board, our work surface, with this watercolor tape, and it's going to hold the edges of the paper in place while it's in that slightly larger state. Then in a couple hours or overnight, all that water will evaporate out of the paper and it's going to try to shrink back to its original size. But this tape will be in place, and the tape at the edges will prevent it from wanting to go fully back to that original size. And it's going to create a tension in the paper that as this dries, it's going to create a very taut surface, kind of like a drum head. And that's going to hold it very smooth and flat the next time that we introduce any water onto it, so that we can paint with freedom of knowing our paper isn't going to have wrinkles and isn't going to bow or curve while we're working on it. All right, let's get started. You're going to need your piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to be taping it onto this board. It's nice because it's mobile, it can be stored away in a cubby, and later on I'm going to be cutting this paper loose from the board, and I don't care if my blades cut into this. Next, I'm going to take this brown gummed tape, gummed because the adhesive has a gum in it, and this is water activated, so the shiny side is the side that's going to be activated by the water. And I'm going to rip some pieces to size before I use any water. I'm going to rip these just a little bit larger than the paper. A little bit. It doesn't need to be several inches longer than the paper, because then I'm just being wasteful. And this stuff is a little spendy. The tape does rip easily by hand. I don't need to have scissors. So I've got 2 for the width, and then 2 for the length. Notice I'm just using the paper as my measurement, and it's a little bit longer than, but not significantly longer than, the length of the paper. It's important to always rip your tape to size before you ever use the water, because this tape is water activated. And once our hands are wet and dripping and we're moving the paper around and it's wet, it's very easy to get water on the tape. And that basically activates this entire section of the tape, and now the tape's going to get stuck to itself through here. And if there's too much water that gets on the tape, it could ruin this whole roll. So students, please make sure that you always prepare your strips of the tape before you ever dunk your paper. So I've got these ready at my workstation. I have a bowl of water and a sponge that I'll be using. And I'm about to take this over to a sink and run water over the front and the back. But before we do so, I want to give a word of advice for where you put the tape once all the water is in the paper and the tape becomes activated. We're going to be placing the tape mostly on the board and a little bit on the edge of the paper. So a good rule of thumb is the width of a pencil. That if that is how far in I'm going to put this tape, and then the rest of the tape will be on the board. It may even wrap over the edge of the board. We don't want to lose much of our surface area, our workspace, to the tape. So here is an example of one that's been taped down at the edges, and there is just a little bit of space between the actual edge of the paper. You can feel it here and where the tape is. Pretty similar to, it's a little bit thicker than a pencil, 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch. The problem is if you overlap too much of the tape on the paper, you lose a lot of your workspace. So here's an example. This is the actual edge of the paper, and they just started putting the tape over most of the paper. And now I have this teeny tiny workspace. Doesn't give me much room to paint, does it? Lot of paper wasted. So only put a little bit of this tape onto the paper. The next step is to take my paper and run it under the faucet so the whole thing is wet, front and back. And be advised that here in the classroom, sometimes my sinks aren't as nice as they are right now. And there might be mud or even bits of paint on the walls of the sink. So when you're running your paper under the water, be careful not to actually place it against the walls or the bottom of the sink, because you might end up with a paper that's not very white anymore. Temperature doesn't matter. Key is just that the whole paper has water on it and that it's dampened all over. So I've got the one side, and now I'm going to flip to the other, and you want to kind of look for if there are any not shiny patches that you missed. That way the water gets over the whole thing. Now I need to run this back over to my wooden board real fast, and the next steps are going to happen real quick. Now I'm going to take my wet paper and place it on the board. Because it's wet and sticky, it's easy to accidentally get wrinkles in this. So I usually start with one edge on the board, and then I kind of walk my fingers over it so that it slowly gets flattened onto the board. So while I'm working, all that water is going to start drying out of the paper, so I have to move pretty quickly. I'm going to take my sponge and dunk it in the water, and the key is I'm going to squeeze out the water so that all the excess drips out. It needs to be damp but not dripping. Then I'm going to activate the shiny side of the adhesive on this brown gummed tape. So I usually will hold it towards the edge with one hand, and then I will swipe across, and I usually go about 2 swipes across so that I know I get the left edge and then I know I get the right edge. And now I have to watch while the adhesive activates. And usually the tape sort of arcs kind of bends up and actually stands up off the table, and you can see that happening right now. And then after that glue is activated and it sort of arcs and stands up, then it'll start to flatten out. I think you can see that already happening right now. Sometime after it starts to sit back down flat, I need to check and see if it's sticky. I need to make sure my hands aren't too wet when I try this. If I touch it and it sticks to my finger, it's sticky enough to use. If your finger doesn't stick to it and the tape just falls off, then it's not ready. I'm going to overlap on the width just a little bit, like the width of a pencil, and then push it down really firmly. Really press it down with your fingertips and try to get it to stick to the board. And I think while I was demonstrating and talking, I may have moved a little too slow because it didn't quite stick on this edge. So I can swipe across with the sponge to try and reactivate that tape and get it to stick. All right, I usually like to work in opposites. That way I know there's a tension helping to hold the paper down. So I am going to adhesive the other opposite edge of the paper. Damp but not dripping. Activate and watch to make sure that it does its thing. When you're first learning this process, I recommend that you only activate one piece of tape at a time because you have to move quickly. And when you're not as confident in your movements, it's easy for your tape to actually dry out while you are doing the first strip. So one at a time, that way you know it's sticky. When you get better at this, sometimes I'll activate one or two at a time just to save time, but I don't recommend it when you're first learning this. Alright, so I pressed this, made sure it had a really good connection with my paper, and there's a little bit extra, so I may kind of fold it over or around my board. If it doesn't stick on the ends, that's fine. A lot of the time, it doesn't want to stick to the texture on these boards. Alright, now for the length. A common mistake is when students don't wring out the extra water and they use too much on the tape, or if they go over the tape too many times, you can actually get this water activated tape too wet to the point where it's not sticky anymore. And if that happens, it'll just sit kind of limply, and no matter how many times you try to do the stick test, it won't be sticky because it's just too much water. Alright, I finished pressing on the tape around all four sides, and given just a few minutes, my paper has already dried and it's quite flat and smooth. Though I've been doing this for several years and I'm pretty confident in how to activate the tape and apply it. So if you end up with like a little wrinkle in here, or if one of the pieces of tape falls off or doesn't want to stick, that's okay. That's kind of to be expected with this learning curve. Now before I go ahead and start using this for a painting, I want to make sure that I write my name somewhere on the tape. That way no one else tries to take your board and use it for their own project, and you can tell that this is yours.